Discover the eternal riddle of the Mary Celeste, a perfectly seaworthy ship found drifting in the Atlantic. Every soul on board vanished without explanation. The Atlantic Ocean, in the first week of December, is less a body of water and more a vast heaving entity of slate-grey indifference. It was December 4th, 1872, a Wednesday, though out here, 400 miles east of the Azores, the days of the week held little dominion. Time was measured in watches, in the ringing of the ship's bell, in the rhythmic creaking of timber against the relentless assault of the sea. The brigantine Bay of Gibraltar, a sturdy beast of Nova Scotian oak, cut through the swells with the dogged persistence of a workhorse. She was not a glamorous vessel, but she was sound, her hull seasoned by salt and sun, her rigging taut and singing in the biting northerly wind.
On the quarterdeck, Captain David Morehouse stood with his legs braced apart, his body swaying instinctively with the roll of the ship. He was a man carved from the same stuff as his vessel, weather-beaten, reliable, and possessing a quiet intensity that commanded respect without the need for raised voices. His beard, thick and dusted with the rime of salt spray, framed a face set in perpetual scrutiny of the horizon. The cold was a physical weight today. It seeped through heavy wool coats and thick leather boots, settling into the marrow. Morehouse shifted his weight, pulling the collar of his coat higher, though it did little to shield him from the damp chill that seemed to emanate from the very soul of the ocean. The wind was blowing fresh, whipping whitecaps onto the peaks of the long, rolling waves, sending icy spray rattling across the deck like buckshot. It was lonely out here. They had been at sea for weeks, leaving New York behind, bound for Gibraltar with a cargo of petroleum. The routine of the voyage had settled upon them like a heavy blanket. The changing of the watch, the trimming of sails, the meager meals eaten in the swaying galley. It was a monotony that sailors both craved and despised. But today, the monotony was about to be shattered.
It began with a shout from the lookout, a voice thin and snatched away by the wind, yet distinct enough to cut through the ambient roar of the sea. "Sail ho!" Morehouse stiffened. A ship on the horizon was not uncommon, yet in these vast latitudes, any meeting was an event. It broke the solitude, offered a momentary connection to the world of men. He turned, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the overcast sky. "Where away?" he called back, his voice booming with practiced authority.
2 points off the port bow, Captain. She's heading our way." Morehouse reached for his spyglass. The brass was cold against his ungloved fingers, a biting reminder of the temperature. He stepped to the rail, bracing his elbows on the wood to steady his aim against the ship's heave. He closed one eye and brought the instrument to the other, the world compressing into a circle of magnified gray. At first, there was only the restless ocean, a blur of heaving water and low clouds. Then, the stranger swung into view. She was a brigantine, like the Bay of Gibraltar, roughly the same tonnage, but even at this distance, something was wrong. A seasoned mariner reads a ship like a scholar reads a text. The set of the sails, the angle of the heel, the line of the wake, all tell a story of intention and competence. The story this ship was telling was one of confusion. She was under short canvas, barely enough to keep her steady in this wind. She was yawing, swinging clumsily to port, then correcting sharply as the wind caught her, then falling off again. It was the movement of a drunkard or a blind man stumbling in the dark. There was no rhythm to her, no guiding intelligence visible in her course.
"Mr. DeVoe." Morehouse lowered the glass, his brow furrowed. Oliver DeVoe, the first mate, was already at his side, a burly man with eyes that missed nothing. "Aye, Captain?" "Take a look, Oliver. Tell me what you make of her." DeVoe took the glass, wiping the lens with a rough thumb before raising it. He watched in silence for a long moment, his body swaying in counterpoint to the deck. The wind whistled through the shrouds, a lonely, high-pitched keening.
"She's handling poorly, sir," DeVoe said finally, not lowering the glass. "Yawing like she's got no one at the wheel. And look at her head sails. The jib is set on the wrong tack for this wind. She's backing and filling." "Is she in distress?" Morehouse asked, the unease beginning to coil in his gut. "She doesn't look damaged," DeVoe replied slowly, handing the glass back. "Masts are sound. Hull looks high in the water. But she's drifting, Captain. Just drifting."
Morehouse raised the glass again. They were closer now, the gap between the two vessels closing with every surge of the Atlantic. He could make out details now, the paintwork, the line of the rail. And then a jolt of recognition struck him like a physical blow. He knew this ship. He knew her lines, her rig, the way she sat in the water. "My God," he whispered, the words lost to the wind. "It's the Mary Celeste." The name brought a flood of memories. Benjamin Briggs. Captain Benjamin Briggs. A friend, a man of integrity, a teetotaler, a devout Christian, and one of the finest sailors Morehouse had ever known. They had dined together in New York just days before their respective departures. Briggs had been optimistic, happy. He had his wife, Sarah, with him, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. They were bound for Genoa with a cargo of industrial alcohol. The image of the little girl with her bright eyes and infectious laugh flashed in Morehouse's mind, a stark contrast to the desolate gray reality before him.
If this was the Mary Celeste, where was Briggs? Why was his ship staggering across the ocean like a ghost? "Are you certain, Captain?" DeVoe asked, seeing the look on Morehouse's face. "I am," Morehouse said, his voice grim. "That's Ben Briggs' ship, and Ben Briggs doesn't sail like that, not unless he's dead or dying." The atmosphere on the deck of the Dei Gratia shifted instantly. The curiosity of the crew curdled into apprehension. Sailors are a superstitious lot, living in a world governed by forces they cannot control. A ship behaving strangely is an omen, a disruption of the natural order. The man at the rail exchanged dark glances, their murmurs low and anxious. "Alter course, Mr. DeVoe," Morehouse commanded, shaking off the paralysis of the shock. "Bring us within hailing distance. Pass the word to stand by." The Dei Gratia leaned into the turn, her bow coming around to intercept the erratic stranger. As they drew nearer, the silence of the Mary Celeste became a palpable thing. It was not merely the absence of noise, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to dampen even the sound of the wind. The ocean washed against her hull with a hollow slapping sound. Her torn sails flapped uselessly, a sound like pistol shots in the quiet.
There was no smoke from the galley chimney, no movement on the deck, no face at the rail. Just wood, canvas, and the immense, uncaring sea. Morehouse picked up the speaking trumpet, a conical brass instrument designed to amplify the voice over the roar of the elements. He waited until they were parallel, the two ships separated by perhaps 100 yards of churning water. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the cold air. "Ahoy!" he bellowed, the trumpet directing his voice toward the silent brigantine. "Mary Celeste, ahoy!" The sound traveled across the water, clear and commanding. The crew of the Dei Gratia held their breath, waiting for a response. An arm waved, a head popping up, a flag raised, anything to signal life. But there was nothing, only the whistle of the wind in the rigging and the groan of timbers. The Mary Celeste sailed on, indifferent to their presence, her wheel turning idly, her bow swinging pointlessly toward the horizon. "Again, Captain," DeVoe urged quietly. "Ahoy the ship, Captain Briggs!" Morehouse shouted again, desperation creeping into his tone.
This is the Day Gratia. Do you require assistance?
Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. It was a silence that spoke of tragedy, of a story that had ended in darkness. The dread on the Day Gratia was now thick enough to taste. It tasted of iron and bile. "She's a ghost ship, all right," whispered one of the seamen, a grizzled old hand named Anderson. "Not a soul on board, mark my words."
"Stow that talk," DeVoe snapped, though his own face was pale. "Captain, we can't just leave her. If Briggs is hurt or sick—" "I know," Morehouse said, lowering the trumpet. His heart was hammering against his ribs. The thought of Sarah and little Sophia alone on that drifting hulk was a nightmare he couldn't suppress. "We have to board her." It was a decision fraught with risk. The sea was running high, the waves steep and treacherous. Launching a small boat in these conditions was dangerous, and boarding a ship that might be riddled with plague or worse, waiting with a mutinous crew, was a gamble with their lives. But the code of the sea and the bond of friendship left no other choice.
"Mr. DeVoe, pick 2 men. Lower the yawl. I want you to board her. Assess the situation. If there are souls aboard, help them. If not, find out what happened." DeVoe nodded, his jaw set. He signaled to Anderson and another seaman, Wright. The 3 men moved to the davits, their movements efficient but tense. The small boat was swung out over the rushing water. The Day Gratia hove to, trying to create a lee, a patch of calmer water, but the ocean was uncooperative. The boat hit the water with a splash, bobbing violently like a cork.
DeVoe and his men scrambled down the netting, timing their jumps with the rise and fall of the swell. As they pushed off, the perspective shifted. From the deck of the Day Gratia, the Mary Celeste had been a fellow vessel. From the waterline, she was a towering, looming fortress. The dark hull rose up like a cliff face, slippery with algae and slime. The name on the stern, Mary Celeste, seemed to mock them. DeVoe sat in the stern sheets of the small boat, steering with a heavy oar, while Anderson and Wright pulled at the oars. Their breathing was heavy, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the mental terror of what they might find.
Every stroke brought them closer to the enigma. The silence of the Mary Celeste grew louder the closer they got. It was an unnatural quiet, devoid of the usual hum of a living ship. No chickens clucking in the coops, no footsteps, no voices, just the creak, creak, creak of the yards swinging loose. As they came alongside the main chains, the shadow of the brigantine fell over them, pooled and foreboding. DeVoe looked up at the rail, half expecting to see a face peering down, a madman, a corpse, a ghost. But there was only the gray sky and the frayed end of a rope dangling in the wind.
"Steady," DeVoe whispered, as much to himself as to the men. "Oars up." They grabbed the chains, the small boat banging against the hull. DeVoe reached up, his hand closing around the cold iron of the chain plate. He paused for a second, his heart pounding in his ears. He was about to step onto a mystery that would haunt the world for a century. He pulled himself up, hand over hand, until his eyes cleared the rail. He swung a leg over and dropped onto the deck.
The deck of the Mary Celeste was wet. That was the first thing he noticed. Just wet wood, scrubbed clean by the sea. He stood up, drawing his knife instinctively. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded small, intrusive in the vast quiet. He waited. Nothing. He walked slowly toward the aft cabin, his boots thudding softly. The wheel was loose, spinning gently with the roll of the ship. The binnacle stand was knocked out of place. He looked around. The ship was not a wreck. She was seaworthy, but she was empty. It was as if the crew had simply evaporated into the mist. DeVoe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. He walked to the companionway, the entrance to the cabin where Briggs and his family should have been. The doors were open. Darkness lay below. He took a breath, gripped his knife tighter, and took the first step down into the gloom. The unanswered hail of the Dei Gratia still echoed in his mind, a question that the ocean refused to answer. The longboat cut through the heaving slate-grey swells of the Atlantic, a tiny splinter of wood navigating the immense, indifferent lungs of the ocean. First Mate Oliver Deveau sat in the stern, his gloved hand gripping the gunwale, his knuckles white against the dark, wet leather. The spray from the oars kissed his face with a freezing intimacy, tasting of salt and deep, cold fathoms. Ahead of them, the brigantine Mary Celeste yawed sluggishly in the trough of the waves, a dark silhouette against the bruising purple and charcoal of the horizon. She did not ride the water like a living thing. She wallowed, heavy and unresponsive, her rhythm out of sync with the breathing of the sea. The silence that hung over her was not merely the absence of noise, it was a physical weight, a tangible barrier that their small boat was piercing with every stroke of the oars. From the deck of the Dei Gratia, she had looked like a vessel in distress. From down here, amidst the whitecaps and the valleys of water, she looked like a tomb. Deveau exchanged a glance with second mate John Wright, who was pulling at the port oar. Wright's face was set in a grim mask, his eyes fixed on the looming hull, reflecting a superstition that every sailor carries in their marrow, the fear of a ship that sails itself. They drifted into the shadow of the brigantine. The water here was darker, sheltered from the pale watery sun that struggled through the overcast sky. The hull of the Mary Celeste rose like a cliff face, streaked with salt and the green slime of the sea, the paint peeling in ragged strips that fluttered silently in the wind. The sound of the ocean changed here. The rhythmic crash of waves was replaced by a wet, slapping sound, the water hungrily lapping at the wood. "Easy oars," Deveau commanded, his voice sounding thin and swallowed by the vastness. The men shipped their oars, the wood clattering loudly in the locks, a sudden intrusion of human mechanics into a natural void. The longboat drifted alongside, bumping gently against the barnacle-encrusted hull. Deveau stood up, balancing against the swell, and reached for the chain whales. The metal was bitingly cold, slick with moisture. He hauled himself up, his boots scrambling for purchase on the wet siding, his breath puffing in white clouds before him. Deveau crested the rail and swung his leg over, his boot connecting with the deck. Thud. The sound was dull, heavy, and isolated. He stood there for a moment, one hand still gripping the shroud, waiting for a shout, a challenge, the bark of a dog, the creak of footsteps. There was nothing. The silence that greeted him was profound and unnerving. It was not the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning in harbor, nor the tense silence of a crew before a storm. It was a living silence, a vacuum that seemed to suck the air from his lungs. It was filled with the groans of the rigging, the high-pitched keen of the wind through the lines, and the relentless slap of water against the hull. The ship was wet, soaked through as if from a recent deluge or the constant assault of sea spray. Pools of water trembled on the deck planks, reflecting the gray turmoil of the sky above.
He signaled for Wright and the others to follow. As the men clambered over the rail, their boots hitting the deck, they instinctively huddled together, their eyes darting left and right, scanning for a threat that refused to reveal itself. "Ahoy!" Deveau called out. The word hung in the air for a second before being torn away by the wind. No answer, no echo, just the creak of the mainmast and the rustle of canvas. The sails were a tableau of chaotic neglect. The lower topsail was set, catching the wind and driving the ship in its erratic, lurching course. But the foresail and the upper topsail had been blown out, hanging in tattered ribbons that snapped like whips. The main staysail lay loose on the forward house, a
heap of wet canvas that looked like a collapsed lung. It was the disarray of a moment frozen in time, a snapshot of activity halted by an unseen hand. DeVoe began to walk aft, his footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the wooden planks. The deck felt solid beneath him, yet the ship felt hollow. He approached the helm, the nerve center of any vessel. The wheel, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, spun freely, untended. It kicked left and right with the surge of the rudder, a ghost hand guiding the ship nowhere. DeVoe placed a hand on the rim of the wheel to stop its erratic motion. The wood was polished smooth by the hands of men who were no longer there. He looked around the quarterdeck. No helmsman, no officer of the watch, no body. The binnacle stand was damaged, the compass inside shifted out of place, its glass cover cracked. It was a small detail, but it spoke of a sudden shock, a violent lurch, or a frantic accident. "Sir," Wright whispered, approaching from the side. He didn't need to shout. The silence amplified even the softest utterings. "Look at the pumps." DeVoe nodded and moved to the main deck. One of the pumps had been drawn, the sounding rod lying on the deck beside it. It was as if someone had been in the middle of checking the bilge levels and had simply stopped, dropped the rod, and vanished. DeVoe picked it up. It was cold, wet, and unremarkable, yet holding it felt like holding a piece of evidence from a crime scene. He dropped it back to the deck, the clatter startling a seagull that had perched on the yardarm. The bird took flight with a harsh cry, the only living thing they had seen so far.
They moved forward, their formation tight, like soldiers in enemy territory. The ship's single yawl, the lifeboat, was conspicuously missing. DeVoe stared at the empty cradle on the main hatch. The lashings had been cut, not untied. The jagged ends of the rope lay on the deck, fraying in the wind. A railing on the port side was removed, leaving a gaping mouth in the ship's defenses. This was the exit. This was where they had gone. But why? The ship was sound. The hull was intact. There was water in the hold, yes. DeVoe could hear it sloshing below, but not enough to sink her, not yet. Why abandon a ship that was still floating for a tiny open boat in the middle of the Atlantic winter? It defied all nautical logic. It defied the survival instinct. As they explored further, the scene became increasingly strange, a collage of the mundane and the impossible. Near the galley, tools were scattered across the deck, a wrench, a hammer, a chisel. They weren't stowed away, they were dropped, mid-task, mid-stride. It was as if the ship had been shaken by a giant hand, or as if time itself had snapped. DeVoe crouched down to examine the deck. No blood, no scorch marks, no signs of a struggle. If there had been a mutiny, where was the violence? If there had been panic, where was the wreckage? The orderliness of the ship's structure clashed violently with the emptiness of its crew. It was a stage on which the play had abruptly stopped. The actors vanished into thin air, leaving the props exactly where they lay. DeVoe walked to the rail and looked out at the ocean. The Day Gratia was a mile away, a beacon of rationality in this sea of madness. He felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by the memory of eyes. The ship felt inhabited by its own abandonment. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of questions that had no answers. He turned back to Wright. "Check the forward cabin," DeVoe ordered, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'll check the captain's quarters." Wright nodded, swallowing hard, and moved off.
DeVoe approached the companionway leading down to the captain's cabin. The darkness below seemed thicker than the air above. He placed a hand on the doorframe. The wood was damp. He took a breath, tasting the stale air of the interior, a mix of mildew, oil, and the lingering faint scent of tobacco. He stepped down, leaving the gray light of the day for the gloom of the below decks. The stairs creaked under his weight, announcing his arrival to a room that held no one to hear it. The cabin was dimly lit by the skylight above, which was covered with a canvas to keep out the spray. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching and retracting with the roll of the ship. DeVoe's eyes adjusted. A table stood in the center. On it, a chart was laid out. He leaned over. The last entry was dated days ago. Beside the chart, a slate with rough calculations. A pen, a bottle of ink, uncapped but not spilled. The normalcy of it was terrifying. A harmonium stood against the wall, its keys silent, sheet music open on the stand. A child's toys were scattered on the floor, a doll, a block. DeVoe stepped around them carefully, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space, a place of family, of life, now turned into a museum of absence. The bed was unmade, the impression of bodies still faintly visible in the sheets. He opened the logbook. The entries were standard: wind direction, speed, position. Nothing about a leak, nothing about a storm, nothing about fear. The writing was steady, the hand of a man who believed he had a future. And then, simply, nothing. The narrative of the Mary Celeste ended not with a period, but in the middle of a sentence. DeVoe closed the book. The leather cover felt cold. He looked around the cabin one last time. It was perfectly normal and fundamentally wrong. It was a home where the occupants had stepped out for a moment and never returned.
He climbed back up to the deck, the fresh air hitting him like a physical blow. Wright was waiting for him, his face pale. "Nothing forward, sir," Wright said, his voice trembling. "Crew's quarters are empty, dry. Sea chests are there, clothes hanging up to dry. It don't make sense, sir. They didn't take nothing. Not their pipes, not their money, not their oilskins. Who leaves a ship without their oilskins in this weather?" DeVoe looked at the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the deck. The ship groaned, a long, mournful sound from the timber. The Mary Celeste was a riddle written in wood and canvas, floating on an ocean that kept its secrets. The missing lifeboat was the only clue, a subtraction that explained nothing. Why go? What terror could be greater than the sea itself? What could make a captain take his wife and child into a fragile yawl in the middle of the ocean, leaving behind a sound vessel? The wind picked up, whistling through the torn rigging. The sound was like a choir of ghosts, whispering in a language DeVoe couldn't understand. He felt a profound sense of isolation. They were intruders here, walking on the grave of a mystery. The silence of the deck was closing in on them, heavy and suffocating. "We need to salvage her," DeVoe said, his voice hard. "We can't leave her here." But as he said it, he felt a resistance in his own heart. A part of him wanted to get back in the longboat, row back to the Bay of Gibraltar, and sail away, leaving this ghost ship to the fog and the deep. But he was a sailor, and the sea had laws. A ship found was a ship claimed.
He walked back to the rail, looking down at their longboat bobbing in the water. The men below looked up, their faces pale ovals in the gloom. They were waiting for a signal, for an explanation. DeVoe had none. He looked back at the empty wheel, spinning idly. The Mary Celeste sailed on, piloted by the wind and the waves, carrying a cargo of silence. He placed his hand on the gunwale, feeling the vibration of the ship, a pulse that had outlasted the hearts of her crew. "Get a tow line ready," he shouted down to the boat, breaking the spell. But the echo of his voice died quickly, absorbed by the hungry silence of the deck. As the men scrambled to obey, DeVoe remained standing at the rail, a solitary figure on a stage of wood, surrounded by the invisible audience of the missing, feeling the chill of the Atlantic seep into his soul, a cold that he knew would never fully leave him. The silence of the Atlantic is a deceptive thing.
On deck, it is masked by the wind in the rigging and the slap of waves against the hull. But below the waterline, silence takes on a physical weight, a density that presses against the eardrums and settles into the marrow of one's bones. Oliver Deveau stood at the head of the companionway, his hand resting on the polished brass rail, looking down into the gloom of the Mary Celeste's interior. The air that drifted up from the belly of the ship was not the foul stench of death he had half expected, nor the acrid smoke of a fire, but something far more unsettling. It was the smell of suspension. It smelled of damp oak, stale tobacco, varnished wood, and the faint, sweet, coppery tang of solitude. It was the scent of a room that has been closed off from the world, holding its breath, waiting for occupants who had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Deveau signaled to Wright, his second on this boarding party, to follow close. They descended the stairs, their boots striking the wood with a sound that seemed violently loud in the stillness. The light from the open hatch above thinned as they went deeper, replaced by a murky twilight that filtered through thick glass portholes and the skylights of the main cabin. Every creak of the ship's timbers as it rolled in the swell sounded like a footstep, causing both men to pause, hands drifting instinctively to the knives at their belts, eyes darting toward the shadows. But there was nothing, only the play of light and shadow, the groaning of the joinery, and the rhythmic slosh of bilge water far below. They moved first toward the crew's quarters in the forecastle. This was the domain of the common sailor, a place usually rife with the chaos of men living in close confinement. Deveau expected overturned chests, broken bottles, the signs of a struggle or a frantic, drunken exodus. He pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a dry squeal that died instantly in the heavy air. He raised his lantern, the flame sputtering and casting long, dancing shadows against the curved bulkheads. What the light revealed stopped him cold. The forecastle was not a scene of devastation. It was a scene of eerie order. The bunks were dry. The blankets were not torn from the beds in haste, but lay rumpled only as much as a sleeping man might leave them, or in some cases, neatly smoothed. "God in heaven," Wright whispered, his voice cracking. "Where are they?" Deveau stepped further inside, his eyes scanning the minutiae of the room. He approached a sea chest lashed to the foot of a bunk. It was not locked. He threw the lid back. Inside, the contents were folded with the precision of men who take pride in their meager possessions. Woolen jerseys, spare trousers, darning kits. He lifted a heavy pea coat, checking the pockets. Nothing but a few shreds of tobacco. He moved to a small table bolted to the floor. There, sitting as if placed down only moments ago, was a clay pipe and a razor. He picked up the pipe. The bowl was cold, but the ash inside was not scattered. It had been set down gently. Beside it, a small mirror hung from a nail, swinging slightly with the ship's motion, catching the lantern light and throwing an erratic beam across the dark wood. "If they were taken by pirates," Deveau murmured, more to himself than to Wright, "then they were the most polite pirates to ever sail the Main." He reached into another chest, digging deeper until his fingers brushed against the cold metal of a coin purse. He pulled it out, loosening the strings. Gold and silver glinted in the lantern light. He looked at Wright, holding up the coins. "Pirates do not leave gold. They do not leave coats. They do not leave pipes."
They backed out of the forecastle, closing the door as if afraid to disturb the slumber of the ghosts that seemed to inhabit the space. They moved aft toward the captain's cabin. This was the heart of the mystery. Captain Benjamin Briggs was a man of reputation, a man of order. He had his wife, Sarah, and their little girl, Sophia, with him. The presence of a family changed the nature of a ship. It softened the hard edges of maritime life. As Deveau approached the door to the main cabin, he felt a sense of intrusion far stronger than he had in the crew's quarters.
To enter a captain's private sanctuary was a breach of maritime etiquette. To enter it when it was empty, yet filled with the echoes of a family, felt like a desecration. The door to the cabin was open. The interior was flooded with a dim underwater light from the skylight overhead, which was closed and secured. DeVoe stepped over the threshold, his boots landing on a carpet that felt damp but not soaked. The scene before him was a tableau of domestic life frozen in amber. It was not the chaotic aftermath of a mutiny, it was a home. To his left stood a rosewood harmonium. He ran a finger across the keys, suppressing the urge to press one and break the silence. Sheets of music were stacked neatly. Beside it, books were scattered on a shelf, not thrown, but shelved. He recognized the titles, navigational texts, a Bible, a few novels. The normality of it was terrifying. He turned his gaze to the center of the room. The table was the centerpiece of the haunting. It was set. Plates, utensils, cups. There are stories that would later be told of steaming coffee and boiled eggs still warm, but DeVoe saw the truth, which was starker. The food was there, yes, but it was cold, stale, aged by the days of abandonment. A hard-tack biscuit lay on a plate, untouched. A cup stood waiting for a mouth that had vanished. It was a meal interrupted, a communion broken. Wright was standing by the captain's bunk. "Sir," he called out softly, "look at this." DeVoe crossed the room. The bed was unmade. The impression of a body was still visible in the mattress, a hollow where Captain Briggs might have rested his head. But it was the smaller details that twisted the knife in DeVoe's gut. On a small side table lay a woman's sewing machine. Under the needle, a piece of oilskin was clamped, the thread trailing off. Sarah Briggs had been mending, or perhaps making a toy for the child. She had stopped mid-stitch. Why? What sound, what cry, what sudden realization had caused her to lift her hands and walk away, never to return? And then the child's presence. On a bunk that must have been Sophia's, a doll lay prone, staring up at the deckhead with painted glass eyes. A wooden block lay on the floor. DeVoe picked it up. It was heavy, solid, real. He thought of his own family, of the safety of the hearth, and a shiver violently racked his frame. This was not just a ship, it was a nursery. The violence of the ocean felt abstract when fighting a storm on deck, but here, among the sewing needles and the dolls, the ocean felt like a predator that had swallowed them whole without breaking a single plate. "Where are the papers?" DeVoe asked, shaking off the dread. "The logbook, the chronometer." They searched the desk. The ship's log was gone. The sextant was gone. The chronometer was missing. These were the tools of navigation. Their absence was the most rational thing they had found yet. It meant the departure was not a panic of pure instinct. It was a calculated evacuation. They had planned to navigate. They had planned to survive. But the slate log lay on the table. DeVoe picked it up, reading the chalk scrawlings. The last entry was dated November 25th, 10 days ago. 10 days of silence.
Finally, they descended to the lowest level, into the cargo hold. This was the business end of the Mary Celeste. The manifest listed 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, a volatile cargo, dangerous if mishandled, but valuable. As they climbed down the ladder into the dark cavern of the hold, the smell changed. The damp wood scent was overlaid with the sharp, medicinal sting of raw spirit. DeVoe held his lantern high. The barrels stretched out into the darkness, row upon row of red oak staves bound with iron hoops. "Check the stowage," DeVoe commanded. They moved through the narrow aisles between the barrels. The cargo was secure. The wedges were in place. There was no sign of the cargo shifting violently, which might have caused a panic. but as they worked their way aft, the smell grew stronger. "Here," Wright said, kneeling beside a barrel. "This one is empty." They found 9 barrels in total that were empty. Not broken, not smashed, but empty. Had they leaked? Had the fumes built up? DeVoe considered the possibility of an explosion. A small one, perhaps, enough to blow a hatch cover and terrify the crew into the boats. He looked up at the deckhead. No charring, no blackening, no sign of fire. Just the empty barrels and the lingering fumes. DeVoe sat on one of the barrels for a moment, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. The magnitude of the mystery was suffocating. He ran through the checklist in his mind. Is the ship sinking? No. She has taken on some water, perhaps 3 feet in the hold, but she's timber-laden and buoyant. A few hours at the pumps would clear her. Is she dismasted? No. The rigging is sloppy, some sails are blown out, but the spars are sound. Is there a fire? No. Is there a lack of food? No. Is there a sign of violence? No. It makes no sense, sir, Wright said, echoing DeVoe's thoughts. It's like they just stepped off. Like the sea called them and they went. Men don't just step off a sound ship, right? A captain like Briggs doesn't leave his vessel unless he believes she is doomed. He doesn't put his wife and child into a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic unless he thinks staying aboard is a death sentence. DeVoe stood up, his boots echoing on the hull planks. But she isn't doomed. She's the most sound thing within 1,000 miles, except for our own Dea Grazia. The realization was a cold horror. Whatever had happened, whatever terror had gripped Captain Briggs and his crew, it had been a terror of the mind or a terror of the moment that had passed as quickly as it came. They had abandoned a fortress to take their chances in a nutshell, and the ocean had swallowed the nutshell while sparing the fortress. DeVoe climbed back up the ladder, his movements heavy, leaving the hold, passing back through the galley, and taking one last look at the captain's cabin. The scene burned itself into his memory. The sewing machine, the toy block, the unlit pipe. It was a tragedy written in negative space, a story told by what was missing rather than what was present. The silence of the Mary Celeste was not empty, it was screaming with questions that would never be answered. As he stepped back out into the blinding sunlight of the upper deck, the fresh wind felt like a slap, a reminder of the living world that still turned, indifferent to the frozen moment of time he had just witnessed below. He looked across the water to the Dea Grazia, where Captain Morehouse waited for a report. What could he say? How does one report a ghost story? "She is fit to sail," DeVoe said to the wind. "She is fit to sail, and she is empty."
The silence of the Atlantic is not a true silence. It is a tapestry of wind, the groan of timber, and the ceaseless rhythmic slap of water against the hull. Yet, as Oliver DeVoe stepped across the threshold into the mate's cabin of the Mary Celeste, the silence he encountered felt distinct, heavy, and unnatural. It was the silence of a clock that had suddenly stopped ticking, the hush of a room where a conversation had been interrupted mid-sentence, never to be resumed. The air inside was stagnant, trapped between the bulkheads, smelling faintly of old tobacco smoke, damp wool, and the permeating sharpness of brine. Behind him, John Wright and Anderson waited, their breathing audible, their presence crowding the narrow passageway. They were intruders here, ghosts walking through a tomb that had not yet been sealed. The lantern DeVoe held aloft cast a swaying amber circle of light that danced over the mahogany paneling, revealing the intimate details of a life suspended in animation. A jacket hung on a peg, swaying slightly with the ship's roll. A pair of boots sat in the corner, toes pointing outward as if the owner had just stepped out of them. It was maddeningly ordinary. There was no blood on the floorboards, no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture suggesting a desperate defense against pirates or a mutinous crew. There was only order, a terrifying, pristine order that defied the chaotic reality of an abandoned ship
drifting aimlessly in the mid-Atlantic. DeVoe moved toward the desk. It was a sturdy piece of furniture, bolted to the floor, its surface scarred by years of use, but clear of clutter. In the center, resting like an offering on an altar, lay the ship's logbook. This was the voice of the vessel. In maritime law and tradition, the logbook is sacred. It is the undeniable record of truth, the timeline of reality in the featureless expanse of the ocean. If there were answers to be found, if there was a reason why the Mary Celeste had become a ghost ship, it would be written there in the ink and script of the first mate or Captain Briggs himself. DeVoe felt a tremor of anticipation, a tightening in his chest that was half hope, half dread. He imagined what he might find, scrawled entries detailing a fever sweeping through the crew, a sudden leak that defied the pumps, or perhaps the terrified account of a sea monster or a rogue wave. His hand, calloused and stained with tar, hovered over the leather cover. The leather was cool to the touch, damp from the humid air. "Open it, sir," Wright whispered, his voice cracking slightly. The sound startled DeVoe, reminding him that he was not alone. He nodded, gripping the edge of the cover and pulling it back. The binding creaked, a dry, protesting sound in the quiet cabin. The pages were thick, textured paper, covered in neat, looping handwriting. DeVoe did not go straight to the end. Instead, he flipped back a few weeks, seeking the rhythm of the voyage. He needed to establish the baseline of normalcy to understand the deviation. He read entries from early November, weather reports, wind direction, knots traveled, sail adjustments, routine, boring, beautifully, horribly routine. November 10th, November 15th. The ship was making good time. The cargo of industrial alcohol was secure. The family, Sarah Briggs and the little girl, Sophia, were mentioned only in passing, implying their safety and comfort. He turned the pages faster now, the dates blurring until he reached the final written page. He smoothed the paper down. The entry was dated November 25th, 10 days prior. DeVoe leaned closer to the lantern, squinting at the ink. It was not scrawled in haste. The handwriting was steady, the loops of the L's and F's precise.
He spun around, scanning the cabin with frantic intensity. "The ship's register," he barked at Wright. "Find the documentation. The papers proving ownership, the cargo manifest. They should be in the captain's safe or the strong box." The men scattered, searching the small cabin, opening lockers and checking under the bunk. Minutes passed, the tension ratcheting up with every empty compartment. Finally, Wright stood up, his hands empty, his expression pale. "They're gone, sir. The navigational instruments, the ship's papers, all gone." DeVoe leaned back against the desk, the heavy realization settling onto his shoulders. This changed everything. If the ship had been abandoned in a panic, fire, explosion, sudden sinking, the captain would not have taken the time to collect his chronometer and sextant. Those were heavy, delicate instruments. In a life-or-death scramble, you save people, maybe food. You don't save the tools to calculate longitude unless you plan to navigate a small boat for a long distance. "He took them," DeVoe whispered, the horror of the logic dawning on him. Captain Briggs. He didn't flee in a panic. He left. He packed his instruments. He took the ship's register. He ordered the lifeboat launched. "But why?" Anderson asked, gesturing at the solid walls around them. "The ship is sound. She's floating high. A bit of water in the hold, sure, but nothing the pumps couldn't handle. Why would a seasoned captain take his wife, his baby daughter, and his crew into a tiny open boat in the middle of the Atlantic, leaving a perfectly good ship behind?" That was the question that turned the blood in DeVoe's veins to ice. The missing lifeboat, which they had noted earlier, was now confirmed to be the vessel of their escape. But escape from what? The logbook said the weather was fine. The hull said the ship was sound. The food stores were plentiful. The water was fresh. DeVoe looked at the blank page following the entry of November 25th. It was a white void, a tabula rasa where the tragedy should have been recorded. It was a scream of silence.
If there had been a mutiny, the mutineers might have thrown the captain overboard, but they wouldn't have abandoned the ship themselves. It was their prize, their survival. If there had been pirates, they would have looted the cargo, not left the expensive alcohol and the crew's personal effects. Maybe they thought the ship was sinking, Wright suggested, his voice trembling. Maybe they panicked. Briggs was a veteran, DeVoe snapped. He knew the sea. He knew ships. He wouldn't abandon a brigantine for a rowboat unless he was absolutely certain the ship was about to go down under his feet. And look around you, man. She is not down. She is here, floating, mocking us. DeVoe picked up the logbook again, running his thumb over the edge of the pages. The mystery had shifted. It was no longer a question of what happened physically. The missing boat and instruments told that story. They had left deliberately. The mystery was why. What phantasm, what terror, what erroneous belief had seized the mind of Captain Briggs so completely that he felt safer in a 20-foot yawl on the open ocean than on the deck of this sturdy vessel? The mundane nature of the last entry made it infinitely worse. If the log had ended with, "God help us, the pumps are failing," DeVoe could have understood. He could have mourned them as victims of the sea's cruelty. But to end with "past St. Mary's Island" implies that the horror struck in the daylight, in the calm, amidst the routine. It implied that the threat was sudden, overwhelming, and perhaps invisible. He looked at the chronometer box again. The velvet lining was indented where the instrument had sat for years. The absence of the object felt like an amputation.
The arrival of the Mary Celeste in the Bay of Gibraltar did not bring the silence of resolution, but rather the cacophony of a mystery that would soon engulf the world. The vessel, guided by the exhausted and bewildered salvage crew from the Day Gratiot, dropped anchor in the shadow of the great rock, appearing to the casual observer as just another merchant brigantine resting from the Atlantic toil. Yet there was a palpable aura of wrongness that seemed to emanate from her timber, a vibration of abandonment that unsettled even the hardened dockworkers who secured her lines. The water of the harbor, usually a mirror of commerce and routine, seemed to recoil slightly from the hull, as if the ship herself was contagious with an unknown affliction. Captain Morehouse, standing on the deck of the Day Gratiot, looked across at his prize with eyes that held no triumph, only a deep, gnawing unease. He had brought her in, he had done his duty by the laws of the sea, but the silence of that empty deck weighed heavier on his soul than any cargo he had ever hauled. The news traveled not by the slow pace of sail, but by the electric hum of the telegraph cables that now crisscrossed the ocean floor, binding the continents in a web of instant communication. Within hours, the initial report, a ship found under full sail, buoyant and undamaged, yet utterly void of life, transformed from a maritime curiosity into a global sensation. It was the winter of 1872, and the Victorian world, obsessed with both the triumphs of engineering and the dark allure of the Gothic, found in the Mary Celeste a perfect vessel for its collective anxieties. The wires sang with the impossible details, the Morse code tapping out a rhythm of suspense that reached the far corners of the empire before the sun had set on the Mediterranean. In the smoky newsrooms of London's Fleet Street and the clamorous offices of the New York Herald, editors smelled blood in the water. The facts were too sparse, too sterile to sell papers, and so the vacuum of evidence was quickly filled with the rushing air of speculation. Typesetters worked with feverish speed, their blackened fingers arranging letters into headlines that screamed of horror and the inexplicable. The phantom ship, mystery of the ages, ocean tragedy. The journalists, unburdened by the need for accuracy in the face of such a void, allowed their imaginations to run wild. They crafted narratives that borrowed heavily from the fiction of the day, turning a maritime accident into a penny dreadful come to life. The first whispers began in the taverns of Gibraltar, where sailors, their tongues loosened by rum and fear, exchanged theories that grew more grotesque with every retelling. They spoke of the ship as if she were a beast that had devoured her masters. "She looks clean," one old salt would mutter, peering into his tankard, "but the sea don't take a whole crew without a fight, not unless the devil himself was at the helm." These rumors drifted from the docks to the governor's mansion, seeping into the consciousness of the officials charged with investigating the affair. The atmosphere in Gibraltar shifted from curiosity to suspicion, a thick fog of distrust that would soon envelop the salvage crew. The official inquiry, led by the formidable and deeply suspicious Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar, began not as a search for truth, but as a hunt for guilt. Solly Flood, a man whose rigid adherence to the law was matched only by his lack of maritime imagination, could not conceive of a disaster that left no scars. To him, the pristine state of the Mary Celeste was not evidence of a peaceful evacuation, but a deception, a stage set by cunning actors to hide a heinous crime. The first whispers began in the taverns of Gibraltar, where sailors, their tongues loosened by rum and fear, exchanged theories that grew more grotesque with every retelling. They spoke of the ship as if she were a beast that had devoured her masters. "She looks clean," one old salt would mutter, peering into his tankard, "but the sea don't take a whole crew without a fight, not unless the devil himself was at the helm." These rumors drifted from the docks to the governor's mansion, seeping into the consciousness of the officials charged with investigating the affair. The atmosphere in Gibraltar shifted from curiosity to suspicion, a thick fog of distrust that would soon envelop the salvage crew. The official inquiry, led by the formidable and deeply suspicious Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar, began not as a search for truth, but as a hunt for guilt. Solly Flood, a man whose rigid adherence to the law was matched only by his lack of maritime imagination, could not conceive of a disaster that left no scars. To him, the pristine state of the Mary Celeste was not evidence of a peaceful evacuation, but a deception, a stage set by cunning actors to hide a heinous crime.
If not mutiny, then what? The whispers shifted to the external. The Barbary coast was not far. The specter of piracy still haunted the Mediterranean imagination. The Riff Pirates theory took hold, painting a picture of swarthy raiders swarming the rails, slaughtering the crew, and carrying the women off into slavery. It was a narrative steeped in the racial prejudices and fears of the era, a convenient projection of villainy onto the other. People nodded sagely in coffee houses, discussing the dangers of the African coast, convinced that the answer lay in the savagery of brigands. But this too failed to align with the physical evidence. Pirates, by definition, are thieves, yet the Mary Celeste's cargo remained untouched. The personal effects of the crew, pipes, tobacco, sea chests, were still in place. Even the locket left behind by Mrs. Briggs sat undisturbed. What manner of pirate boards a ship, kills everyone, and leaves the loot behind? The logic was fractured. The ship floated as a rebuke to every rational explanation, a locked-room mystery played out on the open ocean. As the rational explanations were stripped away one by one, the public mind turned toward the dark waters of the supernatural. The Victorian era was a time of spiritualism, of seances and table-turning, where the boundary between science and the occult was often blurred. If men could not explain the Mary Celeste, perhaps monsters could. The sea monster theory emerged from the depths of maritime folklore. Illustrations appeared showing a colossal octopus or a giant squid, the legendary kraken, wrapping its tentacles around the brigantine, plucking the screaming sailors from the deck like ripe fruit. It played into the primal fear of the abyss, the idea that nature contained horrors too vast for humanity to conquer.
Others spoke of sea serpents, ancient and hungry, that had risen to feed. The ocean was still largely a map of terra incognita, a place where dragons might still exist. To the land-bound public, the idea of a beast rising from the black water was terrifying, yet strangely satisfying. It was an act of God, or at least of nature, rather than the malice of man. More esoteric theories drifted into the realm of the paranormal. Had the ship sailed through a rift in the ether? Had they encountered a ghost ship, a flying Dutchman that lured them to their doom? Some even whispered of abduction by vessels from the stars, a precursor to modern UFO lore, though they lacked the vocabulary to describe it as such. These stories were not merely entertainment, they were a psychological defense mechanism. To accept that a seasoned captain, a loving father, and a competent crew could simply vanish without a trace, without a reason, was too terrifying to contemplate. It suggested a universe of chaos where cause and effect could be severed. The monsters, at least, provided a cause. Meanwhile, in Gibraltar, the inquiry ground to a frustrating halt. Solly Flood, defeated by the lack of evidence, was forced to release the Dei Gracia and the Mary Celeste. He could prove no murder, no fraud, no piracy. The court awarded a salvage payment, but it was a fraction of the ship's value, a final petty slap in the face to Captain Morehouse, a lingering mark of official suspicion that would stain his reputation for years. The official verdict was open, a legal admission of ignorance. The court had failed to tame the mystery with the gavel of law. The Mary Celeste was repaired and sent back to sea with a new crew, but she carried a heavy cargo of superstition. Sailors, a notoriously superstitious lot, branded her a rogue ship, a vessel cursed by whatever force had swept her decks clear.
The passage of time acts as a filter for the truth, stripping away the varnish of hysteria to reveal the grain of reality beneath. For decades following the discovery of the Mary Celeste, the public imagination was held captive by the grotesque and the fantastical. The empty ship was a canvas upon which the Victorian world painted its darkest nightmares. Giant cephalopods dragging sailors into the abyss, mutinous crews consumed by bloodlust, seaquakes that swallowed souls but left wood untouched, and spectral interventions that defied the laws of theology and physics. However, as the 19th century bled into the 20th and the sensational headlines of the New York Herald and the Gibraltar Chronicle faded into the archives, a different kind of scrutiny began to take hold. The mystery transitioned from the realm of ghost stories to the cold, hard light of forensic analysis and maritime science. The question shifted from what supernatural force took them to what rational terror could drive a seasoned captain to abandon a seaworthy vessel. The answer, many scholars and naval architects now believe, lay not in the sky or the sea, but in the dark, cramping belly of the ship itself. It lay in the cargo. The 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol lodged in the hold were not merely silent passengers, they were a volatile chemical beast sleeping fitfully beneath the feet of Captain Benjamin Briggs and his family. To understand the tragedy of the Mary Celeste is to understand the nature of this cargo and the invisible, silent threat it posed, a threat that creates a terror far more potent than any kraken, the fear of imminent, fiery annihilation. The shipment was industrial alcohol intended for the fortification of Italian wines, a substance of high proof and significant volatility. In the lexicon of maritime danger, raw alcohol occupies a terrifying tier. It is a cargo that breathes. It reacts to the ambient environment, expanding with heat and contracting with cold, its molecular bonds agitated by the ceaseless motion of the ocean. The barrels themselves become the critical variables in this equation of disaster. The Mary Celeste was carrying alcohol packed in red oak barrels, a crucial detail that distinguishes this voyage from others. Red oak is a porous wood, far more permeable than the white oak typically used for such potent liquids. It breathes, it sweats, and under the duress of a transatlantic crossing, with the ship groaning and twisting in the swells, the integrity of these staves becomes compromised. It is a matter of historical record that when the cargo was eventually unloaded in Genoa, 9 of the barrels were found to be empty. Not breached, not smashed, but empty. This detail, often overlooked in the early feverish recountings of the tale, is the keystone of the alcohol vapor theory. Where did the contents of those 9 barrels go? They did not simply vanish into the ether, they leaked. They seeped out, slowly, invisibly, pooling in the bilges or evaporating directly into the stagnant air of the hold. And here lies the genesis of the fear. Alcohol vapor is insidious. It is heavier than air, tending to settle in low places, accumulating in the dark recesses of the hull. It is also colorless, and while it possesses a distinct odor, in the salt-sprayed, tar-scented world of a brigantine, the nose can be deceived until the concentration reaches a critical mass. The journey of the Mary Celeste had been plagued by rough weather. The Atlantic in November is a chaotic beast, churning with storms that would have battered the small vessel, tossing her from crest to trough.
To a layman, it is just a smell. To a captain carrying 1,701 barrels of explosive liquid, it is the scent of death. Briggs knows the properties of his cargo. He knows that if the vapor concentration is high enough, a spark from a shifting barrel hoop, a friction fire, or even the galley stove could ignite the entire ship. The Mary Celeste would not just burn, she would disintegrate. She would become a splintered firework on the surface of the ocean. The fear that gripped Briggs in that moment was not the panic of a coward, but the calculated terror of a protector. He faced a binary choice: stay on board and risk being blown to atoms in the next second, or evacuate the ship temporarily until the danger passed. The evidence on the ship supports this theory of a controlled, precautionary evacuation rather than a panicked flight from a phantom. The ship was not in disarray. There were no signs of violence. The crew's pipes were stowed, not dropped mid-smoke. The oilskins were left behind, suggesting they expected to return, or left in a hurry but without chaos. Crucially, the ship's navigational instruments, the chronometer and the sextant, were missing. This is the smoking gun of the rational evacuation theory. If one flees a monster or a ghost, one does not stop to grab the sextant, one runs. But if one is abandoning ship with the specific intent of waiting out a potential explosion and then reboarding, one takes the tools necessary to navigate. Without the chronometer and sextant, they would be lost on the open ocean. Taking them implies a plan. It implies a belief that they would need to navigate the lifeboat, either back to the ship or to the nearest land. The missing ship's register and papers further support this. Briggs was securing the legal identity of the vessel and his command. The lifeboat, a small yawl, was launched. This was not a simple task in a rolling sea. It required order and discipline. The crew, led by the first mate, Albert Richardson, would have lowered the boat. Sarah and Sophia would have been handed down first, bundled against the spray. Briggs would have been the last to leave, casting a final, agonizing look at his command, his home, his ticking time bomb. They did not cut the line. They trailed the lifeboat behind the Mary Celeste on a tow line, likely the main peak halyard, keeping a safe distance, perhaps 100 yards, waiting for the fumes to clear or the ship to explode. They sat in the small open boat, bobbing like a cork in the vast Atlantic, eyes fixed on the brigantine. They waited for the fire. They waited for the explosion that would shatter the morning silence. But the explosion never came. The nature of the vapor leak was likely such that the gas vented into the atmosphere, dissipating harmlessly once the hatches were opened or the pressure equalized. The fumes of fear were real, but the catastrophe was potential, not actual. The tragedy lies in what happened next. The wind picked up. The Mary Celeste, her sails still set to catch the breeze, began to gather speed. A sudden gust, a rogue wave, or simply the tension of the tow line against the heaving masses of the two vessels caused the rope to snap. The sound of that parting line would have been the true death knell of the Briggs family.
In an instant, the physics of the ocean turned against them. The Mary Celeste, unmanned but seaworthy, sailed away, driven by the relentless trade winds. The lifeboat, heavy with people and lacking sails, could not hope to catch her. We can visualize the horror of that separation. Captain Briggs clutching the useless sextant, watching his ship, safe, sound, and exploding only with speed, disappear over the horizon.
The Atlantic Ocean, a vast and breathing entity of indifferent slate-gray, held the small yawl in its cold, undulating palm. It was the 25th of November, 1872, though time seemed to have lost its rigid structure, melting into the rhythmic rise and fall of the swell. In the cramped wooden belly of the lifeboat, 10 souls sat huddled, a microcosm of humanity suspended above an abyss of 3,000 fathoms. They were not yet panicked, for hope is a stubborn creature, but a heavy blanket of caution and unease had settled over them, damp and clinging like the salt spray that misted their faces. Captain Benjamin Briggs, a man of fortitude and temperate habits, sat at the stern, his hand resting firmly on the tiller, his eyes fixed on the brigantine they had just evacuated. The Mary Celeste rode the waves a mere 400 feet away, a tethered leviathan, connected to their fragile sanctuary by a single slender tow line, the peak halyard, repurposed in haste as an umbilical cord between safety and the unknown danger of the fumes. The ship looked peaceful now, stripped of the terror that had propelled them over the rail. She rolled gently, her sails set to catch the breeze, her hull seemingly intact. The vaporous threat of the alcohol cargo, which had earlier seemed to presage a catastrophic explosion, was invisible from this distance. There was no smoke, no fire, only the silent, majestic architecture of wood and canvas against a sky that was slowly turning the color of a bruised plum. Sarah Briggs, wrapped in a heavy shawl that did little to ward off the permeating chill, clutched her daughter Sophia to her chest. The child, barely 2 years old, whimpered softly, confused by the sudden transition from the nursery's warmth to this exposed, wet world of creaking timber and endless water. Sarah's eyes met her husband's, seeking reassurance and finding there a reflection of her own suppressed anxiety. He gave her a curt, tight nod, a silent promise that this was temporary, a precaution that would soon be deemed unnecessary. Around them, the 7 crewmen, hardy Germans and Danes, men of the sea who knew its temperas, sat in a tense silence. They were crowded, knees knocking against knees, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Gottlieb Gondeschall, the second mate, stared at the tow line, watching it dip into the water and snap taut with the differing drifts of the 2 vessels. It was a lifeline, literally and metaphorically, the only thread binding them to their floating home, to their provisions, to their lives. The plan was sound, or so they told themselves. They would wait. They would let the hold air out. If the ship did not explode, if the fumes dissipated, they would haul themselves back, climb the side, and laugh about the day they took a boat ride in the middle of the Atlantic. But the ocean is not a passive stage for human dramas. It is a dynamic, chaotic force governed by laws of physics that care nothing for human intentions. The weather, which had been manageable, began to shift with the treacherous swiftness of a mood swing. The wind, previously a stiff breeze, began to moan a lower, more ominous note through the rigging of the distant ship. The surface of the sea, previously choppy, began to heave with greater amplitude, the waves growing taller, their crests foaming with white spite. It was not a hurricane nor a monster wave, but a sudden squall, a common enough temper tantrum of the North Atlantic, yet fatal in its timing. The sky darkened, the clouds swirling in a chaotic dance of charcoal and slate, obscuring the sun and casting a prematurely early twilight over the scene.
There was a sound, not a boom, but a sharp, sickening crack, like the report of a pistol or the breaking of a bone. The rope parted. The recoil sent the loose end whipping back toward the ship, lashing the water, while the end attached to the lifeboat fell limp, trailing uselessly into the depths. A collective gasp, more terrifying than any scream, rose from the boat. For a heartbeat, there was a paralysis of disbelief. Then chaos. "Oars! Out oars!" Briggs roared, his composure shattering under the weight of the realization. "Row! For God's sake, row!" The men, galvanized by the sudden terror of separation, scrambled to deploy the oars. Wood clattered against gunwales, frantic hands fumbled with thole pins. But the ocean was no longer a flat surface, it was a moving mountain range. The yawl pitched violently, throwing the men off balance. When they finally dug the blades into the water, the effort was Herculean and heartbreakingly futile. They pulled with every ounce of strength in their sinewy arms, their backs straining, their lungs burning, but the Mary Celeste was free. Unburdened by the drag of the boat, pushed by the squall that filled her topsails and courses, she began to walk away from them. It was a slow, agonizing departure. She did not vanish instantly. She simply sailed with a ghostly elegance, correcting her course slightly as the wheel turned unattended. The crew in the boat rowed until their hands bled, until their muscles screamed, but the gap widened. 10 yards became 50, 50 became 100. The physics of sail versus oar in a heavy sea were undeniable. The squall brought rain, a stinging, freezing curtain that reduced visibility and soaked them to the bone, mixing fresh water with the salt of their tears and the ocean spray. Sarah Briggs did not scream. She simply pulled Sophia tighter, burying her face in the child's hair, refusing to watch the ship, their home, their clothes, their food, their future shrink into the gray distance. The crewmen, realizing the futility, began to falter. The rhythm of the oars broke. One by one they stopped, chests heaving, eyes wide with the dawning horror of their predicament. They were alone. The realization settled over them like a shroud. They were in a 20-foot open boat, hundreds of miles from the Azores, hundreds of miles from Portugal, with no compass, no water, no food, and no shelter. The Mary Celeste was now a silhouette against the darkening horizon, a beautiful, indifferent shape sailing on a starboard tack, oblivious to the tragedy she was leaving in her wake. The irony was suffocating. The ship was not sinking, she was not burning, she was sailing perfectly, a ghost ship in the making, manned by the wind and the waves. Briggs stared at the receding speck, his heart breaking, not just for himself, but for his wife, his daughter, and the men who had trusted him. He had made a decision to save them from an explosion that never came, and in doing so, he had condemned them to a slower, colder death. The squall passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a choppy, restless sea and a silence that was louder than the storm. The sun, now low in the west, broke through the clouds, casting a golden, mocking light over the scene. It illuminated the Mary Celeste one last time, a tiny white fleck on the edge of the world, before she slipped over the curvature of the earth and vanished. The horizon was now an unbroken line of empty water. The crew of the yawl sat in the gathering dusk, the only sound the slap of water against the hull and the soft, rhythmic sobbing of the child. There were no words left to be spoken. The sea, vast and ancient, had claimed them, not with violence, but with a terrifying, passive patience.